President Zelensky spent 5.5 hours yesterday in talks with US and European officials. There are further meetings that are getting underway as we speak. The US envoy Steve Witkoff is there in Berlin alongside the President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Day two of the talks will include the European leaders at some point today. It's reported that Mr. Zelensky has made one major concession at least. He's talked about dropping Ukraine's aspiration to join Nato in return for an Article 5 style guarantee. So let's cross and speak to Anita McVeigh, our colleague who is in Berlin. What more do we know, Anita, about the sort of framework of today's discussions?
Yeah, well, we understand, Christian, there are more contacts going on between the US and American delegations. We've been hearing that the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, has been engaged in some shuttle diplomacy today. Now, that's really interesting because he is very well liked by President Trump, gets along very well with the president. He was in the White House along with other European leaders and was then in the White House for a bilateral meeting with the president as well in recent months. So what role is he playing? We don't know the detail of that yet, but it's a very interesting little snippet into what is happening here in the German capital. So I think for more detail on this, we have to look to what President Zelensky said yesterday when he, and this is a quote from him, above all, there has to be a proper framework. He said this just can't be a piece of paper with no proper guarantees. And I think that phrase, the devil is in the detail, is a really appropriate phrase here because clearly that is what the Ukrainians and certainly Ukraine's European allies want, because they are concerned that any deal that is made in a relatively hasty fashion, without the sorts of guarantees that they're talking about, might be one that they come to bitterly regret if it falls apart. So that is why, President Zelensky, for example, is talking about security guarantees being voted on in Congress. So in effect, underwritten by the US Congress. So those are the kind of key areas that we're looking at today. But we are also hearing that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, has again talked about wanting the Ukrainians to cede the territory in the Donbass, which is something that President Zelensky has said Ukraine is not prepared to do. So some really big sticking points still, and whether that will get anywhere today, whether some of that will become unstuck, that remains to be seen, Christian.
Anita, thank you very much. Anita's going to be there throughout the day, so she's going to bring you all the live reaction to those talks in Berlin. Let's focus for a second on Chancellor Merz, who will be centre stage today. Increasingly, he appears to be the front man for the European side. He's certainly been the most outspoken on the US plan and the pro-Kremlin elements that he sees within it. As I say, there are other European leaders set to join the discussions tonight, including, we're told, in the last few minutes, at NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Let's bring in Jenny Mathers, an expert on Russian politics and security. She's at the Department of International Politics in Aberystwyth. Good to see you. Does it suit the Brits and the French to let Chancellor Merz take centre stage?
Well, I think they're taking turns, to be perfectly honest. The European leaders, especially the French and the British and the Germans, are sort of playing a tag team approach to all of these negotiations. London hosts some, Berlin's hosting some. Macron is very prominent as well. So I think in this way, by working together and taking turns on the lead, I think they're hoping to show a united front, but also to be able to use each one's particular advantages and to use each one's ability perhaps to tap into some sort of a relationship with the Trump administration and try and get this arrangement, this deal, whatever it ends up being, less toxic for the Ukrainians and more positive for them.
Why would Alexander Stubb, the Finnish PM, be brought in at an early stage, as well as the NATO Secretary General?
So this looks a bit like good cop, bad cop in some respects. So the Finnish leader, as your correspondent said, gets along well with Trump. Trump gets along well with him. So anything that the Europeans can do to weight the balance in their favor, to give these negotiations and these terms a more positive feel for the Trump administration, make them feel more comfortable in Washington about agreeing to them, they're going to use. So it feels a little bit like a secret weapon. And then, of course, the NATO Secretary General, who's also been very fulsome in his praise of Trump, nevertheless, is there to sound a note of caution, a note of warning about the importance of security guarantees for Ukraine, about the dangers and the threats that Russia is currently posing, not only to Ukraine, but to Europe more widely.
Worth reminding people that the Ukrainians have had security guarantees before. They were given a guarantee by the United States when they gave up their nuclear weapons, the so-called Budapest Memorandum. So you can quite understand why President Zelensky wants this copper bottoming.
Absolutely. And the Budapest Memorandum was basically a promise by the Americans and the British and the Russians to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and its sovereignty. And of course, Russia has totally ignored that, and we've seen the results there. But it only required the signatories to bring any violations to the attention of the United Nations. So no teeth in that whatsoever, and it was tossed away like tissue paper and pretty much forgotten since then. So yeah, the Ukrainians know that it's vital for their future to have something much more solid and substantial to guarantee their security.
Just a quick word, Jenny, on these economic zones, which seems to be an idea Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump are pushing. This idea that the Ukrainians withdraw from the areas they currently hold. And then what? I mean, who polices those areas, and how do you prevent the Russians from advancing?
Well, this has the hallmarks of a Trump bright idea that has not been thought through very well, because the Russians, first of all, have said, oh, well, even if there is some sort of a zone like this, that they're going to insist that their National Guard will patrol it, and that they will provide sort of security for it and so on. So I think it's pretty meaningless. It's very unlikely that anything like this is actually going to transpire, because it's hard to see what would happen in such a zone, who would be looking after it, and what the conditions would be. So yeah, I suspect this one's going to sink without a trace.
Jenny Mathis, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. You're looking at live pictures here of the arrivals. There is President Zelensky. These are latest pictures, actually, not live. Apparently he's already in the building, sitting down with US officials. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer due to fly out to Berlin after he has spoken with the liaison committee here in London this afternoon. So big European gathering expected.